In Korean entertainment, beauty is never just beauty. It is branding, power, fantasy, and sometimes pressure so intense that even the smallest change in a celebrity's face can become headline material overnight. And when that change is dramatic enough, the conversation turns darker. Fans begin comparing old photos to new ones. Comment sections explode, and suddenly, an idol or actress is no longer being discussed for talent, music, or performance, but for whether cosmetic procedures change their image for better or for worse. That is what makes this topic so uncomfortable, but also impossible to ignore. Because stories like these are never only about appearance. They are about the brutal standards of fame, the obsession with perfection, and the price celebrities sometimes pay when the public decides their face no longer matches the image people remember. And among the most talked about names in these conversations, three stand out: Park Bom, Jung Ryeo Won, and Hong Soo Ah. But this is not just a ranking about looks gone wrong. It is a story about pressure, reinvention, backlash, and the moment beauty becomes controversy. Before going any further, one thing needs to be made clear. This is not a video about mocking faces, humiliating women, or pretending strangers on the internet know every decision a celebrity has made. In an industry as image-driven as Korean entertainment, appearance changes often become public spectacle long before the truth is ever fully known. Sometimes the celebrity speaks openly, sometimes agencies deny rumors, and sometimes the public simply builds a narrative from screenshots, side-by-side photos, and assumptions. That is exactly why this conversation is so complicated. Because when people say a star's cosmetic transformation went wrong, they are usually reacting to more than just surgery itself. They are reacting to shock, to the feeling that a familiar face has changed too much, too quickly, or in a way that clashes with the image people once loved. In other words, controversy is often created at the point where beauty standards, memory, and celebrity branding collide. So, in this ranking, we are not judging these women as people, and we are not pretending to know every private medical detail behind their appearance. Instead, we are looking at something more specific. Which stars became the most talked about examples of cosmetic surgery controversy because of dramatic appearance changes and public backlash? That means this ranking is based on four things. First, there is shock factor. How strongly the public reacted when their appearance seemed noticeably different. Second, there is media and online controversy. How widely those changes were discussed, debated, and dissected. Third, there is impact on public image. Whether the conversation around their looks began to overshadow their work. And finally, there is lasting association. Whether their name is still remembered as part of this kind of controversy even years later. That is why Park Bom, Jung Ryeo Won, and Hong Soo Ah form such a compelling top three. Each one represents a different side of the story. One became a symbol of public shock. One became a case of intense speculation and divided reaction. And one openly stepped into a new image that changed the way the public saw her forever. And the first name on this list may be the most emotionally complicated of all. If there is one name on this list that instantly brings together fame, sympathy, shock, and public discomfort, it is Park Bom. What makes Park Bom such a complicated figure in conversations about cosmetic surgery controversy is that the discussion around her appearance has never really been separate from the discussion around her as a person. She was never just another celebrity whose photos sparked idle gossip for a few days. Over the years, her face became the subject of recurring online scrutiny, with Korean entertainment coverage documenting repeated waves of speculation about plastic surgery as far back as 2012, long before later controversies made the discussion even more intense. And that is exactly why her case feels heavier than simple internet judgment. Because with Park Bom, the public reaction was not only about change, it was about memory. People remembered a very specific image of her from her 21 years. Dramatic, doll-like, already highly stylized, but still familiar. So when later appearances seemed noticeably different, the response was immediate and harsh. One of the clearest examples came in 2020, when her appearance at the Grand Bell Awards triggered another major wave of discussion, with entertainment coverage noting that many viewers were shocked by how different she looked and that plastic surgery rumors surged again almost instantly. What made that moment so significant was not simply that people talked. K-pop audiences talk all the time. What mattered was how quickly the conversation stopped being about Park Bom's music, career, or legacy and became almost entirely about her face. That is when controversy becomes damaging. The image change becomes the headline, and the artist disappears behind it. In Park Bom's case, that happened repeatedly. Her name became attached not just to beauty scrutiny, but to the idea of a star whose appearance had become a public battleground. And yet what makes this story painful is that even the facts people cling to have often remained uncertain or contested. In 2020, Park Bom's agency publicly denied rumors that she had undergone additional plastic surgery, with representatives saying the changes people noticed were not the result of new procedures and attributing her altered appearance instead to stress and weight gain that affected her facial features. That denial matters because it shows how quickly the public had already decided on a narrative before any official explanation was heard. Whether people believed the agency or not, the damage was already done. The controversy had already taken on a life of its own. That is why Park Bom feels like the most emotionally difficult name in this ranking. She represents the point where public fascination becomes almost merciless. She is not remembered in these conversations because people reached a calm, verified conclusion. She is remembered because the reaction was so intense, so repeated, and so tied to the larger tragedy of celebrity image in K-pop. Her appearance changes became something the public could not stop dissecting, and over time that scrutiny became part of her public identity, whether she wanted it or not. That is exactly why Park Bom belongs so high on this list. Because when people talk about Korean stars whose appearance changes sparked the strongest cosmetic surgery controversy, her name is almost impossible to leave out. Not because the internet ever handled her story fairly, but because few cases became as unforgettable, as widely discussed, or as emotionally loaded as hers. If Park Bom's story feels tragic because of how relentless the backlash became, then Jung Ryeo Won's story feels unsettling for a different reason. It lives in the gray zone between visible change and public speculation. That ambiguity is exactly what makes her such a fascinating name in this ranking. Unlike cases where a celebrity openly confirms cosmetic work or where the public conversation becomes tied to one explosive moment, Jung Ryeo Won's controversy was shaped more by suspicion than certainty. Entertainment recaps published years later repeatedly pointed back to 2015 as the period when her appearance became a hot topic, with commentators saying viewers were startled by how different she looked and online discussion quickly turning toward plastic surgery speculation. Just as importantly, even those write-ups framed the issue as rumor, suspicion, and netizen reaction rather than a fully settled public fact. And that difference matters. Because when a controversy is built on uncertainty, it often becomes even harder for a star to escape. There is no clear ending, no final statement powerful enough to close the conversation, and no single moment that resolves what the public thinks it sees. Instead, the face itself becomes a puzzle people keep trying to solve. In Jung Ryeo Won's case, that meant her appearance was discussed not as a temporary curiosity, but as an ongoing question. Had her image changed because of styling, weight loss, aging, cosmetic procedures, or some combination of all of them? The very lack of clarity kept the speculation alive. What made this especially significant was how strongly the shock seemed tied to memory. Jung Ryeo Won had long been associated with a recognizable, delicate screen image, so when later appearances no longer matched the version many viewers remembered, the reaction was immediate. This is often how celebrity image controversy works at its most brutal. The public is not simply comparing a star to beauty standards, but to an earlier version of herself that has already been emotionally fixed in the audience's mind. Once that familiar image is disrupted, even subtle differences can trigger outsized reaction. In her case, some entertainment coverage explicitly described the response as one of surprise and disappointment over a face people felt had changed too far from what they once admired. And yet, what makes her placement here more layered than Park Bom's is that Jung Ryeo Won's career was never reduced entirely to that controversy. Even years later, she continued leading major projects, including The Midnight Romance in Hagwon in 2024, which shows that the public conversation around her image never fully erased her standing as an actress. That is why Jung Ryeo Won belongs on this list. Not because her case is the clearest, but because it may be the most revealing. She represents the kind of cosmetic surgery controversy that thrives on uncertainty, where the public keeps talking, keeps comparing, and keeps projecting conclusions onto a face that no longer matches their memory of it. If Park Bom represents public shock and Jung Ryeo Won represents the gray zone of speculation, then Hong Soo Ah represents something very different. A star whose appearance change became controversial precisely because it was so visible, so dramatic, and so openly acknowledged. Multiple entertainment reports have described her as one of the Korean actresses most candid about having cosmetic procedures, including interviews in which she said she had never regretted them and that the changes helped her career. That honesty is what makes her story stand out. Because in most celebrity image controversies, the public spends years guessing. With Hong Soo Ah, there was much less ambiguity. Coverage around her later career repeatedly emphasized that her face looked very different from her earlier sitcom-era image, and she herself spoke about changing her appearance as she expanded into the Chinese market. Reports also noted that the transformation was so striking that many viewers began comparing her to Chinese actress Fan Bingbing, which shows just how completely her visual identity had shifted in the public imagination. And that is exactly where the controversy took shape. Because once a celebrity's appearance changes enough to make people feel they are looking at a different person, the conversation stops being about simple beauty enhancement and starts becoming a debate about identity. In Hong Soo Ah's case, many of the reactions were not only about whether she looked prettier. They were about whether she had lost the distinctiveness people once associated with her. Some coverage highlighted that she received criticism from people who felt she had traded a more natural, recognizable image for a face they saw as more manufactured or more tailored to another market. What makes her placement in this ranking especially important, though, is that she did not retreat from the conversation. Instead, she addressed it directly. Reports from interviews and television appearances describe her saying she was personally satisfied with her face and that the procedures expanded her opportunities as an actress. That changes the emotional tone of her story. Unlike a case built mainly on denial or unresolved rumor, Hong Soo Ah's story is also about agency, about a celebrity who accepted the backlash but still stood by the decision that reshaped her image. And that is why Hong Soo Ah belongs in this top 3. Not because her story is the saddest, but because it may be the clearest example of cosmetic surgery controversy turning into full visual reinvention. Her face changed so much that it permanently altered how the public talked about her, and even years later, that transformation remains one of the first things people mention when her name comes up. In that sense, her case is not just about surgery. It is about how a new face can create a new career, a new image, and a completely different public memory. What makes this ranking so revealing is that Park Bom, Jung Ryeo Won, and Hong Soo Ah do not represent the same kind of cosmetic surgery controversy. They are linked by public reaction, but the nature of that reaction is completely different in each case. Park Bom represents the most emotionally charged version of the controversy. Her appearance changes triggered repeated waves of public shock over many years, and by 2020, the conversation had become so intense that her agency publicly stepped in to deny rumors of additional plastic surgery, saying the changes people noticed were related to stress and weight gain rather than new procedures. That alone shows how overpowering the narrative around her face had become. Her case was never just gossip. It became a recurring public fixation that often overshadowed discussions of her music and legacy. Jung Ryeo Won, by contrast, represents a much murkier kind of controversy, one built less on confirmation and more on speculation. The public discussion around her appearance was fueled by side-by-side comparisons, visible change, and the feeling that her later image no longer matched the face many viewers remembered from earlier years. But what defines her case is uncertainty. Even the coverage around her tends to frame the issue as suspicion and netizen reaction rather than settled fact. And unlike the other two names, her career was not fully consumed by that narrative, as shown by her continued prominence in later acting projects, including a lead role in 2024. Then there is Hong Soo Ah, whose story may be the clearest in terms of transformation. Her case stands out because she openly acknowledged cosmetic procedures and said they helped her career, especially as her image shifted dramatically enough for the public to compare her to Fan Bingbing. That openness changed the tone of the controversy. Instead of endless guessing, the conversation focused on reinvention, whether the new face made her more beautiful, less recognizable, more marketable, or less uniquely herself. Her story is not defined by denial, but by a very visible choice to embrace a new image despite backlash. And that brings us to the ranking. At number 3 is Jung Ryeo Won. She belongs here because her name has undeniably been part of appearance change controversy. But compared with the other two, the narrative around her is less definitive and less culturally iconic. Her case reveals how damaging speculation can be, but it does not carry the same lasting association or public shock level as the names above her. At number 2 is Hong Soo Ah. She ranks this high because her transformation was dramatic, widely discussed, and openly acknowledged. Her face changed so much that it effectively created a new public image, and that made her one of the clearest examples of cosmetic surgery controversy becoming full celebrity reinvention. But because she owned that transformation so directly, the emotional tone of her story feels different from the most painful case on this list. And at number 1 is Park Bom. Because when people think of Korean stars whose appearance changes sparked the strongest and most lasting cosmetic surgery controversy, Park Bom remains the most unforgettable name. Her case carried the greatest shock, the most repeated backlash, and the deepest sense that public obsession with her face had begun to overshadow everything else. More than anyone else on this list, she became a symbol of how cruel celebrity beauty culture can become when appearance stops being part of the conversation and becomes the entire conversation. And maybe that is the real point of this video. Not to laugh at transformation, but to understand what these stories say about fame itself. In Korean entertainment, a face is never just a face. It becomes memory, branding, expectation, and public property. And once that face changes, the reaction can be merciless. So in the end, this is not only a ranking about controversy. It is a reminder that in the entertainment industry, the pressure to be beautiful can sometimes become powerful enough to erase the person behind the image.